Yesterday we had mentioned that Yaakov, when he had come to the Har Moriah, Mount Moriah, he had fallen asleep and he had a prophetic vision and he saw angels ascending and descending the ladder. What is the significance of the ascent and descent? So I'd mentioned the name of the Midrash, that what Hashem had shown him at this point, all the exiles that the Jews are going to experience in the future, and each of the angels ascending the rungs of the ladder, as many rungs as they ascend, is an indication those are the years of that exile, that particular exile. And then when the angel descends, that means the exile is over. So the first angel he sees ascending the ladder is the archangel of the Babylonians. And then after so many years it comes down, so many rungs it comes down. Then he sees the angel of Modai, the Medes, ascending, descending. And then he sees the angel of Yavon, the Greeks, the archangel of the Greeks, that was the Greek exile, which was during the Second Temple period. Then ultimately he sees the angel of Romi, which is the Edomites, its archangel ascending and doesn't come down. And Yaakov is terrified because he realizes it seems to be there'll never be a recovery. So I mentioned yesterday that Hashem says to Yaakov, don't be fearful. If he doesn't come down himself, I will take him down. I will bring him down. So here the Balaturim, if you have a Mikros Gedolos Chumash, there's a Balaturim, and he writes the words Olim v'yordim bo, ascending and descending bo referring to the ladder, B'gematria, Bavel, Umodai, v'yovan v'romi. Okay, the numerical value is Olim v'yordim bo is the numerical value of the four exiles. That's what he had seen. What is this an indication? At this point, we find that Yaakov is not yet a patriarch. He's not a patriarch. Because until now, we've always had that a patriarch only becomes a patriarch when there's a matriarch. At this point, Yaakov has no wife. But yet, excuse me, Hashem is foretelling the future to Yaakov, what's meant to be in the future. There's no question. He knew, of course, Esau's son of Yaakov, because he had taken the birthright, and that's why he had to flee for his life. But in terms of, at this point, that he should already be told of the future, that means at this point, he's already assuming a level of patriarch. Although Yitzhak and Rivka, his mother and father, are still alive. Because we find that even after he marries, initially his parents were still alive. Yitzhak and Rivka were still alive. But now, because he's assuming that level of patriarch, Hashem already is forecasting and showing him exactly what his children are going to experience in the future. Yud Gimel, next pasuk. V'hinei Hashem nitzav olav. Hashem is standing on top of the ladder, v'yomar, and he says in the prophetic vision to Yaakov, Ani Hashem Elokei Avram Avicha ve'Elokei Yitzchak. I am the God of Avram, your father, and the God of Yitzchak. The land that you are lying upon, to you I will give, and to your progeny, and to your children. Now, there's an obvious question. There's a known chazal that God does not associate his name with a person as long as he's alive. Because, as we'll see, there's a pasuk that a person cannot believe in himself till the moment he's no longer alive. A person has choice until the last breath we have. We could choose to do better, or we, God forbid, chas v'shalom, we could choose to forfeit everything we accomplish in our lives. So Hashem will not identify with the person that he should be called Elokei until the person is no longer alive. Avram is no longer alive at this point. It's Elokei Avram. But Yitzchak at this point is still alive. And yet, when Hashem presents himself to Yaakov, he says, Ani Hashem Elokei Avram Avicha Elokei Yitzchak. I am the Elokei Yitzchak. So take a look in Rashi. Although we don't find anywhere in the pasuk that Hashem associates his name with tzaddikim, regardless of how righteous they are in their lifetime, it's based on a pasuk, a verse in Eov. God does not even rely on those who are most holy. But here, even though Yitzchak was alive, Hashem associated his name with Yitzchak, because firstly, his eyes were weakened, meaning he was on the verge of blindness, and he was confined to the house. That because he was blind, he was confined to the house, and therefore very ukames, and therefore he was like a non-existent person. The Yetzer Posek Bimenu, and therefore he's no longer subject to the Yetzer, to the evil inclination. Therefore, there was no chance that Yitzchak could actually revert in any other direction. So therefore, at this point going forward, he's fixed, he's in stone, he's the tzaddik. Therefore, Hashem is identifying himself with Yitzchak, Elokei Yitzchak. He says two things, because he's blind and he's kodlu b'bayis, and he's confined to the house, he doesn't go out. Now, what's interesting, one of the reasons, there's a question, why was Yitzchak blind? How did he become blind? So Rashi, last week's Parsha, had cited two medrashim. One medrash says that as a result of Esav's wives sacrificing to the idolatry, there was always that smoke. The smoke actually caused him that he should develop this macular degeneration. Therefore, he wasn't able to see, to discern between Yaakov and Esav. The other interpretation, the Medrash says, the reason why he was, relatively speaking, prematurely diminished eyesight-wise was because only in that context was Yaakov able to come take the brachos. Because if he was able to see, he'd see this was Yaakov and not Esav. So therefore, he suffered from this macular degeneration for that reason. Those are two reasons given. Okay? Now, why another reason, which is interesting, which is in this week's parsha, why was Yitzchak confined to the house? What do you think people said up about Esav on the street? Avram Avinu passed away at the age of 175 instead of 180. He had 5 years taken from his life because if Avram would have known what Esav became, it would have been contrary to the promise he had said to him that you will die in a seva tova, a good ripe old age. Because if he would have been aware of Esav, that he committed 5 cardinal sins on one day, it would have actually given him tremendous pain and aggravation. Therefore, Hashem took him 5 years earlier that he should not be aware of this. 5 years of his life was taken. Yitzchak was confined to the house because if Yitzchak would be able to go out and hear what people say on the street, it was inevitable he would hear what people are saying about his son Esav. The man is an adulterer, he's a murderer, he's a cheat, he's a swindler, he does whatever it is. And Hashem wanted to protect Yitzchak that he shouldn't hear any of this. Therefore, as a result of that, he was confined to the house that he never left the house. So he wasn't aware of what was being said on the street. That was the reason why he was called a bias. But factually, what was one of the upside, the positive value of that? Because of that, Hashem allowed that his name should be associated with Yitzchak. Because of that, he was no longer subject to the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination. What comes to mind as I'm speaking, the last 40 years of Vilna Gaon's life, he did not leave a small courtyard in Vilna. He was actually, he had himself confined to that small courtyard where he would actually study with his inner circle of Talmidim students, and he'd have all his tefillos, everything was there. It didn't go out whatsoever, 40 years. So the Dubna Magid, the Magid of Dubna, was a student of the Vilna Gaon. So he said to the Dubna Magid, he says, everybody needs Musar. I want you to give me Musar. So the Dubna Magid was taken aback, and he quotes the Pasuk in Malachi, which we just had in last week's Haftorah, that when you seek Torah from a person's mouth, you should seek it from a person who's the equivalent of Malchei Hashem Tzvados. He's the equivalent of an angel. And as a human being, nobody was closer to being an angel than the Vilna Gaon. In terms of, you read about how he lived his life and how every moment of his life was fully invested at the most advanced level of Torah, and whatever it was, he says, how could I give Musa to a Malach? That's what he said to his Rebbe, to the Vilna Gaon. It's almost like it's disgraceful that me, who am a nothing, that I should give Musa to the Rebbe. So he says, I insist. He says, I insist, and the Dubna Magid, he was famous for coming up with allegories to be able to encapsulate the moment with an allegory to communicate the message. So he says to the Vilna Gaon, he says, of course, for the past 40 years, you've been confined to this courtyard. He says, is it a wonder why you're such a tzaddik, and you're such a Gaon, and you're such a holy person? Why don't you go out to the world and expose yourself to what the world's all about, and let's see what kind of tzaddik you'll be. Meaning he was saying, you're kolu b'bayis. We say the reason why Yitzchak was not subject to the Yetzer Hara was because he was confined to the house. And that's the reason why this illegal nation was no longer had any influence over him. And that's why he merited in his lifetime to be associated with Elokei Yitzchak, because he's not going back there. So he says to the Vilna Gaon, sure, of course you're a Vilna Gaon. Of course you're a holy tzaddik and so on and so forth, and a chassid. You haven't left this courtyard for 40 years. That's what he said to the Vilna Gaon. So Vilna Gaon responded in Yiddish. He says, is it a kunz? In Yiddish, know what kunz means. Is it a trick to be a chassid and a Gaon and a this, where you confine yourself in this courtyard for all these years? So the Vilna Gaon says, Ich bin nicht kein Kunstmacher. I'm not a trickster, meaning I'm not interested in being a hero. I play it safe. It's true. The reason why maybe I am that is because I chose to be confined to this courtyard. Because to expose yourself to every or areas of negative influence where you may be, and despite that, you succeed and you're the hero, he says, I'm not looking to be a hero. I just want to be safe. I want to be who I'm supposed to be. And if it means to be confined to a courtyard for 40 years and not expose myself to the influence of the world, that's what I chose. I'm not interested in being a hero. Yitzchak had no choice. Yitzchak was blind. Yitzchak was older, and therefore he was confined to the house. The Vilna Gaon chose to remove himself from every level of influence or possible influence, which would somehow diminish his status of being who he was. Therefore, he was less susceptible, and therefore he was the holy chassid, tzaddik, and whatever else, the way you would describe the Vilna Gaon. He was at that special level. Just in total digression, unrelated to this. Somebody once asked the Chofetz Chaim, it was known that the asked Reb Chaim Volozhiner, normally as the generations further themselves from Sinai, the generations become lesser, diminish. It's called Niskatno Adoros. The generations become smaller the further we get from Sinai, and yet the Vilna Gaon, they asked Reb Chaim Volozhiner, if you would evaluate your Rebbe and classify him, who would you compare him to be the equivalent of the early Rishonim, going back hundreds of years, which is unheard of? And he was. The Vilna Gaon argues with Rishonim, with the early commentators. So he said, Reb Chaim Volozhiner, if he would evaluate his Rebbe, he would say he'd be the equivalent of Reb Shlomo ben Aderes, of the Rashba. That's what the Reb Chaim Volozhiner said about his Rebbe. So they asked the Chofetz Chaim, if we always say Niskatnu Adorus, that as we further ourselves from Sinai, we're always less. So why was the Vilna Gaon, how did he surpass even generations which preceded him, even the era of the Rishonim? How is it possible? So the Chofetz Chaim said that 99.9% of people are Gilgulim. We're all recycled souls. That means all our neshamas have been here before. And even we spoke about when a neshama comes back, the whole soul doesn't come back. It's the part of the soul comes back that needs that correction. It did not correct in a previous life. The Vilna Gaon had a neshama which never came to this earth before. So there it was a whole soul. Being at that special level of being intact and being holy, all its original potential was there. Therefore, the Vilna Gaon was able to achieve in his lifetime, which nobody else was able to achieve. And because that was his dimension, he had another dimension of spirituality because he had another dimension of neshama. This is what the Chofetz Chaim said about the Vilna Gaon. The Chofetz Chaim, whenever he speaks about, the Chofetz Chaim was somebody we study. The Chofetz Chaim Mishabura, he studied Ber Halacha. There was nothing the Chofetz Chaim didn't know. He had a photographic memory. And when he authored the Chofetz Chaim, that sefer, it took him 25 years to write the Mishnah Berurah and the Ber Halacha and the Sha'ar Tziyun. It was 25 years. And many of the Sfarim that he quotes, the sources, he did not have a library. The Chofetz Chaim just had a few books, a few Sfarim on his bookshelf. Many of it was from memory quoted. There's this famous story that was known that the Panovich Rav had learned B'chavrusa with Rabbi Chonan Wasserman Zecher Tzadik Livrocha for 4 or 5 years. The Panovich Rav came to Rodney, was 20 years old. Rabbi Chonan Wasserman was 36 years old. And the one who paired them up, matched them up, that they should study with one another, they should be study partners, was the Chofetz Chaim. And they were studying at very late in the night, Rabbi Chonan and the Panovich Rav, about 3 a.m, and they came across a certain sefer, a certain work, and they wanted to see it inside. And they knew the Chofetz Chaim quotes this work in a Ber Halacha. So they go to the Chofetz Chaim, and they ask the Chofetz Chaim, they assumed he had the sefer. So the Chofetz Chaim looks at his bookcase. He said, I don't have it. And as he looks at the bookcase, he groans and he sighs. So they say to him, why is the Rebbe sighing? Just had a few svarim on the bookshelf, maybe a Shas, set of Talmud or a few other svarim. He says, you don't realize. He says, to be able to own books, svarim, it's money. Money is time. If money's time, that means I have to expend time to earn that money to be able to buy the books. During that time, if I wouldn't have had to earn the money, I would have been studying Torah. So that's why I sighed. This is what he said. So he says, that sefer, which I quote in the Ber Halacha, I haven't seen in about 45, 50 years. And when I quoted from memory. That's what he quoted. That was the Chofetz Chaim. As great as the Chofetz Chaim was, he said, he quotes Reb Kiva Eger, who Rabbi Pinto says, Alan comes from Reb Kiva Eger. That's what Reb Pinto says. He's a good enough source for me. Reb Kiva Eger was, in his time, he was the father-in-law of the Chassam Sofer, Reb Kiva Eger. He passed away in 1836. Reb Kiva Eger. The Chofetz Chaim, when he speaks about where he believes he could be able to achieve and understand who that person was, he says he couldn't go further back than Reb Kiva Eger. The Vilna Gaon, you can't touch him. I mean, you wouldn't. He's so great that you can't even consider that you even have relevance to his level. You can't even understand his level. That's how the Chofetz Chaim understood who the Vilna Gaon was. Okay, just aside. He was Kolo Babai, so what's the difference? The Vilna Gaon chose to be confined to that courtyard. The Yitzchak Avinu did not choose this. It was his own physical state, his own predicament. He was forced to be confined to his home, as I mentioned, as the Midrash says, because Hashem did not want him to even have an inkling of who Esav became. Because also it would have given him tremendous angst and aggravation if he would have known. So if Yitzchak now lives all these years and he doesn't have the Yetzer Hara, so what's the value of his life? We know that life is a challenge, correct? So if life is to be challenged, and despite the challenge, you take the initiative and do the right thing, Yitzchak no longer had challenge, was no longer challenged because he's in the state that of being confined to the house, as he says, he's no longer subject to the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination. So I always mention the Orach Chaim HaKadosh, that when Rivki Imenu passed away, the question is, when Sarah Imenu passed away at the age of 127 years old, was she meant to live longer, as long as Yitzchak 180 years? But because of that event of being aware of what happened at the Akedah, that caused her to die? No, she wasn't meant to live longer than 127 years. Only, but how did she actually expire? Because she, at that time, she became aware of what happened to Yitzchak. But she was meant to die at that moment, in either case. So Orach Chaim HaKadosh says, the pasuk concludes, Shnei Chayei Sarah. These are the years of Sarah. So the question is, if she lived 127 years, we understand these are the years of Sarah. So Rashi cites the Midrash. When it says, and these are the years of Sarah, it means to say they were all good. The Orach Chaim HaKadosh explains that if her life was cut short by all those years, so, she's being shortchanged. So if she's being shortchanged, she would have lived all those years, she would have accomplished phenomenal things. So Hashem deny her the value and the merit of all those years she would have lived? So Orach Chaim HaKadosh explains that the way Hashem treats his tzaddikim, that since God knows that if he would have lived all those years, they would have achieved and met every challenge and even been more advanced, he credits their account as if they lived all those years, although they did not live those years. That's the Orach Chaim HaKadosh at the beginning of Parshas Chayei Sarah. And that's the meaning, Shnei Chayei Sarah. Although she did not live more than 127 years, the years that she was meant to live, she's fully accredited for the years, although she did not live those years, because if she would have lived those years, she would have met every challenge. So identical here, although Yitzchak at this point is confined to the house, and he's no longer subject to the Yetzer Hara, to the evil inclination, because Yitzchak is alive, and if he would have been exposed to many other things, as he was prior to be confined to the house, and he was that Yitzchak, was that special person, he's not in any way denied the value of the years that he had, that he was subject to the Yetzer Hara. Same principle that the Orach Chaim HaKadosh explains regarding Sarah Imenu. So the Kol HaBaba is not that he's not subject to the Yetzer Hara in any way, does not lessen him and doesn't stop that he's not valued at the more advanced level, although at this point, he's no longer challenged by the Yetzer Hara. I'm just going to... There's a Ramban here. It says, V'hine Hashem nitzav olav. It says, God stood olav. Now, olav doesn't mean on the top of the ladder, or he stood over Yaakov while he's in this state of prophecy, the sleep state, receiving the prophecy. So the Ramban writes over here, we know that this is already Chazal, that who is the greatest of the three patriarchs? Yaakov was referred to as Bechir Sheba'avos. He was the chosen of the patriarchs. He was the one who fathered the 12 tribes. Avram wasn't qualified. Yitzchak was not qualified. Avram had Yishmael. Yitzchak had Esav. Yaakov's children referred to Mitosu Shlema. His family was complete. They were all tzaddikim. He was the Bechir Sheba'avos. We find that David says, God commands his angels to watch the righteous, the devoutly righteous. The Ramban writes, from this point onward, Yaakov needed no shmira from Malochim. It's not Malochim, it's Savloch Ishmorcha. Yaakov became so connected to God at this point. Hashem said to Yaakov, you no longer need any protection from my angels, because I will always be with you. And because I will always be with you, Therefore, you need no protection from anyone. Take a look in the Ramban here.
Is that the pasuk we say after Shalom Aleichem on Friday night?
What? Hine Hashem Nitzav Olav? No, this we say it on Shabbos.
Right.
Yeah. So over here, take a look at the Ramban, Pasuk Yud Beis, if you have a Mikros Gedol's Chumash. Vereyu, it's the second column, the Ramban. Ki Yisborach Nitzav al Asula Mafticho liYakov. God is standing on top of the ladder, and he's promising Yaakov, Maftocha Gedol, with this great guarantee, Lo dia shulo yeh biyad hamalochim. He will no longer be in the hands of the angels. Al v'yechelek Hashem. He will be part of God's portion, and God will continuously be with him. And that's what he says afterwards. I am with you, and I will protect you wherever you go. The spiritual level of Yaakov was greater than other tzaddikim. Other tzaddikim, Hashem commands his malochim to protect them in all his ways, wherever they go, they're protected. But that's the maloch. Yaakov did not need the maloch. Hashem says, from now going forward, I will protect you. The maloch, you don't need the protection of the maloch. Okay? It's interesting. We find something similar. For 7 days on Sukkahs, we sit in the Sukkah. The 8th day, Shmini Atzeres, we don't sit in the Sukkah any longer. Now, what exactly is the Sukkah? The Sukkah is a replication of the Ani Yaakavot. 40 years we were in the desert. The clouds of glory protected us. So the Sukkah, if you meet the criteria of building a Sukkah with the material for the schach, it's the equivalent of being in the Ani Yaakavot. That's what it is. We discussed this. 7 days, you're there. On the 8th day, we always speak, 8 is always Lamala Min HaTeva. That's always transcends nature. Why do we have the 8th day? So the famous Chazal, Hashem says, Koshe Alei Pridaschem. It's difficult for me to part with you, and that shows Hashem's love, although we've been together for 7 days. Koshe Alei Pridaschem. When we're that intimately connected to God, we don't need the Sukkah for protection any longer. When you have that level of relation with Hashem, being with Hashem, that is the protection. You don't need the confines of the Sukkah to provide that protection. What we're talking about here, what we have is a semblance. A semblance means it's not, the word semblance is too much to say. Hashem says to Yaakov, I am with you, Ushmarticho. First, this is when he became the Av. This is when he became the Merkava. But he was a Merkava even greater. His relationship with Hashem was even greater than Avram and Yitzchak. And because he was the Bechir Sheba Avos, he was the most special of the patriarchs who fathered the 12 tribes. Okay, I'm ready for a comment. Alan, you have anything to say? I have to give Alan material for the Sheva Brachos. He's going to be speaking many times. Alan used to MC all the lectures when we were on 63rd Street. So, so he has experience in this area. Go ahead, Alan, go ahead.
Yeah, everything I see going backwards, everything has a purpose. Yeah.
See that.
Are these the angels we're talking about, Rabbi, for the Shalom Aleichem that we accompanied, as on Shabbos?
No, see, again, the two different things. That's not for Shmira. Here we're talking about Shmaticha. Sometimes, let's say you walk with a special person. That's respect. Yaakov being a special person, angels escorted him to the border of Canaan, and he had another group escort him. Not for protection. This is not for protection. That's out of respect in terms of who he is. When the Malachim accompany us home from shul, it's not to protect us. Every Jew has that pair of angels who accompany him home to see what's happening in that home. And that's Gemara Shabbos. If the home looks like a Shabbos home, one angel's a good angel, one angel's a bad angel. If the home looks like a Shabbos home, the good angel says it should be the will of Hashem that next week, this home should be exactly as this week. And the bad angel is forced to say, Amen. And if God forbid you come home and it has no relevance to what Shabbos should be, the bad angel says it should be the will of Hashem that it should be as disastrous next week as this week. And the good angel is forced to say, Amen. Those are those two angels. It's not for the sake of protection. Okay. Mark, you're too quiet.
I guess on come back to the beginning, how is it that we reconcile that Yitzhak had no knowledge whatsoever